A 3-year-old boy sat alone on a bench in Chicago's Union Station at 7 p.m. on November 8th, his small fingers clutching a worn teddy bear as passengers rushed past without a single glance. The temperature outside had dropped to 0 degrees Celsius, and the wind from Lake Michigan cut through the glass doors like invisible blades, carrying the metallic scent of frozen water and diesel fumes. Tyler's left leg bore an orthopedic brace that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, creating small prisms of white across the polished floor. His blonde hair fell across his forehead in unwashed strands, and his blue eyes tracked each departing train with mechanical precision, counting the seconds between arrivals. The massive clock above the departure board showed 19:47, its brass hands moving with audible clicks that echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Around him, the station thrummed with life, businessmen shouting into phones, families dragging suitcases, vendors closing their kiosks with metallic clangs that made him flinch. His father had left him here at 4:30 p.m., when golden afternoon light still streamed through the western windows, and the station smelled of coffee instead of cleaning solution. The promise had been simple. Stay right here, buddy. Daddy's getting our tickets. Then we're going somewhere warm. Those words now felt like smoke. Impossible to hold. Tyler pressed the teddy bear against his chest, feeling the worn fabric where the stuffing had flattened from years of anxious squeezing. The bear's left eye hung by a single thread, and its brown fur had faded to the color of old newspapers, but it was the only constant thing in his 3 years of existence. A janitor pushed a mop past the bench, the chemical smell of pine cleaner mixing with the boy's growing fear. But the man's eyes slid over Tyler like he was part of the furniture. The station's PA system crackled overhead, announcing departures to Milwaukee, Detroit, St. Louis, cities that meant nothing to a child who'd never left the South Side. His stomach cramped with hunger, reminding him that breakfast had been a stale granola bar his father found in the glove compartment. Lunch had been forgotten entirely, lost somewhere between the eviction notice taped to their apartment door and the desperate drive to Union Station with everything they owned crammed into plastic garbage bags. Tyler's small voice whispered to the bear, practicing the words his father had taught him. My name is Tyler. I'm 3. My daddy's coming back. But even at 3, some part of him understood the difference between truth and wishful thinking, between promises and lies wrapped in desperation. The crowd thinned as the evening deepened, families finding their platforms, businessmen catching their connections, until the grand hall felt cavernous and cold, despite the heating vents that rumbled overhead. Shadows stretched longer across the marble floor, and Tyler's legs began to ache from sitting so still, but fear kept him frozen exactly where his father had placed him. A security guard strolled past, his radio crackling with static and incomprehensible codes, his flashlight beam sweeping across the bench without pausing. Tyler held his breath, some instinct telling him that drawing attention might make everything worse, might make the fragile hope of his father's return shatter completely. The station's retail shops began pulling down their metal shutters, each one clanging shut like a door closing on possibility. A coffee vendor dumped the last of his brew into a sink, the rich aroma briefly masking the smell of floor wax and human exhaustion that permeated the air. Tyler's fingers traced the stitching on the teddy bear's belly, following the pattern his mother had sewn before she died giving birth to him. A fact he didn't understand, but had overheard in angry late-night arguments between his father and grandmother. The bear was the only thing he owned that had touched her hands, making it more valuable than food or warmth, or the father who'd vanished. His small body shivered as the temperature dropped further, the station's massive doors opening and closing with each arriving passenger, letting in blasts of Arctic air that smelled of car exhaust and approaching snow. The thin jacket he wore had a broken zipper, and his sneakers had holes in the toes, inadequate armor against a Chicago November. The departure board flipped through destinations with mechanical clicks, each one a place Tyler would never see, adventures he'd never have, a future that seemed to narrow with each passing minute. His blue eyes grew heavy, exhaustion warring with the fear that if he slept, he might miss his father's return, or worse, wake up somewhere even more frightening. A woman in a business suit walked past, her heels clicking sharp staccato rhythms on the marble, her phone pressed to her ear as she complained about delayed trains and incompetent colleagues. She came within 3 feet of Tyler's bench, her perfume momentarily overwhelming the industrial cleaning smells, but her eyes never dropped from her horizontal sightline to notice the small figure below. Tyler shifted on the bench, his leg brace clicking softly, a sound he'd learned to hate because it drew stares and whispers, and sometimes cruel laughter from other children. the cold metal pressed against his skin through his thin pants, a constant reminder of the surgery his father couldn't afford, and the physical therapy appointments they'd stopped attending months ago. The grand clock's minute hand moved to 1947, and something in Tyler's chest tightened like a fist closing around his heart. 7 hours and 17 minutes since his father had walked away, disappearing into the crowd with hunched shoulders and the smell of whiskey following him like a ghost. At precisely 19:47, a man in a black cashmere overcoat entered Union Station through the south entrance, his presence creating an invisible ripple through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Conversations died mid-sentence as people turned away, suddenly finding urgent business in opposite directions, their survival instincts recognizing danger even when their conscious minds couldn't name it. Braden moved through the station with the unhurried grace of someone who'd never had to rush for anything, his Italian leather shoes making no sound on the marble, despite their solid construction. The overcoat hung perfectly from his shoulders, custom-tailored to conceal the weapon he carried, and emphasize the athletic build beneath, while a gray scarf wrapped once around his neck suggested wealth without ostentation. His armored Mercedes had died 2 miles from the station, something about the electrical system that his driver couldn't fix with the tools on hand. The decision to continue on foot and catch a taxi had been unusual. Braden hadn't taken public transportation in 15 years, not since he'd risen from enforcer to the man who gave the orders that made the city bend. The station's usual nighttime energy felt muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on human activity whenever he passed. A police officer near the information booth suddenly remembered paperwork that needed attention elsewhere, and a group of teenagers who'd been loitering near the vending machines scattered like pigeons before a cat. Braden's destination was the taxi stand on the station's north side, a simple journey that should have taken 3 minutes through the main concourse. His mind was occupied with the meeting he'd just left, a negotiation over territory that had gone smoothly because everyone knew the cost of making it go otherwise, when his peripheral vision caught something that made his forward momentum halt. A child sat alone on a bench, illuminated by harsh overhead lights that made his blonde hair look almost white. But it wasn't the solitude that stopped Braden's breath. Children got separated from parents in stations all the time. It was the teddy bear clutched in those small arms, its brown fur faded to newspaper gray, its left eye hanging by a thread. Braden had seen that exact bear before, 23 years ago, when he'd given it to a woman whose name he could still taste on particularly quiet nights. She'd laughed when he presented it, calling him sentimental for a man in his profession, and she'd promised to keep it forever as a reminder that he was more than the reputation that preceded him into rooms. 3 months later, she'd vanished. No note, no goodbye, just an empty apartment and all her belongings gone except for a single photograph she'd left face down on the kitchen table. He'd searched for 2 years, utilizing every resource his growing empire provided, but she'd disappeared more completely than people who'd betrayed him, and knew to fear his reach. The bear should have gone with her, should be in whatever life she'd built far from Chicago's violence and his dangerous proximity. Seeing it here, clutched by a child who couldn't possibly be connected to her, created a cognitive dissonance that made Braden's carefully controlled world tilt slightly off its axis. He moved toward the bench without conscious decision, his body responding to something his mind hadn't fully processed. The few remaining people in the concourse gave him even wider berth, sensing the shift in his attention, the way predators sense when a lion's focus narrows to a single target. Tyler looked up as the shadow fell across him, his blue eyes meeting darker blue ones that had witnessed things no child should ever imagine. For a long moment, neither moved, the boy too frightened to flee, the man too arrested by impossible familiarity to speak. Braden crouched slowly, his expensive coat pooling on the floor around his knees, bringing himself to eye level with the child in a gesture he hadn't made since his nephew's 5th birthday, 3 years ago. Up close, he could see the exhaustion in Tyler's face, the hunger hollowing his cheeks, the way his small body trembled from cold or fear or both. The station's ambient noise faded to background static as Braden studied the boy's features, searching for some echo of the woman who'd owned that bear. The child's face was too young to show clear ancestry, but something about the set of his jaw and the particular shade of his eyes created ghosts in Braden's chest. His voice, when it emerged, was softer than the one he used for business, stripped of the edges that made grown men stammer. "What's your name, Piccolo?" The Italian endearment slipped out unbidden, a word from his grandmother's kitchen that had no place in his current life of clean violence and calculated intimidation. The boy's mouth opened, closed, then opened again as if testing whether sound would actually emerge. "Tyler," came the whispered response, so quiet that Braden had to lean forward to catch it, close enough now to smell the unwashed hair and the fear sweat that no 3-year-old should produce. Around them, the station continued its evening rhythm, but within the invisible circle of Braden's attention, time moved differently. A janitor started to approach with his mop, saw who was kneeling on his freshly cleaned floor, and reversed direction so quickly he nearly tripped over his bucket. "Where's your father, Tyler?" Braden kept his voice level, neutral, though something dangerous had begun coiling in his chest. Not anger, not yet, but the precursor that always preceded his most decisive actions. The boy's appearance told stories that didn't require words: the inadequate clothing, the orthopedic brace that needed adjustment, the hollowness that spoke of missed meals and absent care. Tyler's fingers tightened on the bear, and his gaze dropped to the marble floor where someone had spilled coffee hours ago. The brown stain dried into the shape of continents on a map. "He said he was getting tickets, said we're going somewhere warm." The words carried the mechanical quality of repeated lies that a child had practiced into believing. Braden remained kneeling on the cold marble, his coat absorbing dust and God knows what else, while his mind performed calculations that had nothing to do with business strategy or territorial control. The station's clock ticked over to 1950, and he understood with sudden clarity that this child had been waiting far longer than any ticket purchase required, that somewhere warm was a destination that existed only in desperate promises. He looked at the teddy bear again, at the specific pattern of wear on its belly, where someone had sewn careful stitches in white thread against brown fabric. His chest tightened with a certainty he couldn't explain and wouldn't question. This bear was the one he'd given away, which meant this boy was connected to the woman who'd vanished, which meant letting him disappear into Chicago's broken foster system was categorically impossible. Tyler's blue eyes lifted back to his, and Braden saw something there that struck harder than any revelation about the bear. The boy wasn't crying, wasn't begging, wasn't doing any of the things abandoned children typically did. He was simply waiting with the patience of someone who'd learned early that tears changed nothing, and hope was a luxury measured in minutes. A security guard appeared at the edge of Braden's peripheral vision, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt before recognizing who knelt before the bench. The hand dropped immediately, and the guard's face went carefully blank, but not before Braden caught the flash of concern about the child mixing with the fear about approaching a man whose displeasure could end careers and sometimes lives. "How long have you been sitting here?" Braden asked, though the answer was already written in the boy's exhausted posture and the way his small body had begun to list sideways, like a ship taking on water. Around them, the station's lights seemed to brighten as the exterior darkness deepened, creating a theatrical effect that felt inappropriate for what was unfolding. "Since the sun was up," Tyler whispered, and the simple honesty of it, no exaggeration, no plea for sympathy, just fact, made something crack in Braden's carefully maintained emotional armor. He'd built an empire on reading people, on understanding motivation and leverage, and the precise pressure points that made humans bend. But this child's straightforward acceptance of abandonment bypassed every defense he'd constructed. Braden's hand moved without conscious thought, reaching out to brush the blonde hair back from Tyler's forehead, where sweat and grime had matted it despite the station's cold. The boy flinched but didn't pull away, and that small detail, that learned acceptance of touch that might be gentle or might not, ignited something in Braden's chest that felt dangerously close to the rage he usually reserved for men who broke agreements or touched things that belonged to him. He pulled out his phone, the movement making Tyler's eyes widen, but instead of calling his driver or his lawyer, Braden simply held down a button that connected him to the only person who never questioned his orders. "Clear the North Concourse. Now. And get me someone from DCFS who understands discretion." He ended the call before his second-in-command could respond, because questions were unnecessary when he used that particular tone. Within 90 seconds, the area around their bench had emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm audible only to certain frequencies. The few stragglers who'd missed the initial exodus found themselves guided firmly away by men in dark coats who'd appeared from nowhere, their movements coordinated with the precision of military operations applied to civilian crowd control. Braden stood slowly, his knees protesting the cold marble, and removed his cashmere scarf with deliberate care. He wrapped it around Tyler's thin shoulders, the gray fabric enormous on the small frame, the gesture so foreign to his usual interactions that his hands hesitated momentarily before completing it. The scarf still held his body heat, and the faint scent of the cologne his tailor insisted was appropriate for a man of his position. Tyler looked down at the scarf, then up at Braden, his expression cycling through confusion and wonder, and a fragile hope that was almost painful to witness. "Are you going to help me find my daddy?" The question came with the earnestness of a child who still believed in helpful strangers and happy endings, concepts Braden had abandoned by age 10. Before he could formulate an answer that was honest but wouldn't destroy what little hope remained in those blue eyes, a woman in a practical navy suit appeared at the concourse entrance. She carried a worn briefcase and had the exhausted expression of a social worker who'd seen too much and could be surprised by nothing. But she stopped short when she recognized who'd summoned her, her professional composure cracking just slightly. "Mr. Braden," she managed, her voice steady despite the fear that flickered across her face like summer lightning. She'd been at this job for 15 years, had dealt with gang leaders and drug dealers and fathers who shouldn't have custody of goldfish. But she'd never been in a room alone with the man who ran the North Side like a feudal kingdom wrapped in expensive suits. He gestured to Tyler without preamble, his voice returning to its usual efficient coolness. "This boy has been abandoned here." His father left him at approximately 4:30 p.m. according to his statement, which makes it nearly 8 hours. He pulled out his wallet, extracted a business card that had only a phone number printed on expensive cardstock, and held it out to her. "You'll document this properly and begin whatever process is necessary for emergency custody. You'll also call that number every day with updates, and you'll understand that my interest in this case is not optional." The social worker took the card with trembling fingers, her eyes moving between Braden and the small boy, wrapped in a scarf that probably cost more than her monthly salary. She'd heard stories about what happened to people who disappointed this man, and while she'd always assumed they were exaggerated, standing in his presence made her reconsider that optimistic assessment. Tyler's hand suddenly gripped Braden's coat with surprising strength for such a small child, his voice rising to something close to panic for the first time. "You're leaving too?" The question carried betrayal that hit harder than it should. This child's assumption that every adult eventually walked away, that protection was temporary and promises were lies waiting to be revealed. Braden looked down at the small fingers clutching Italian wool, at the teddy bear pressed between them, at blue eyes that had somehow managed to crack through defenses he'd spent decades perfecting. He crouched again, bringing himself back to Tyler's level, and spoke with the kind of certainty he usually reserved for declaring territories and ending negotiations. "I'm not leaving. You're coming with me." The words emerged before his rational mind could intervene, before he could calculate the complications or question the wisdom of attachment to a 3-year-old who represented mysteries he'd stopped trying to solve years ago. The social worker made the call to police while Braden carried Tyler to his car, the boy's weight almost nothing in his arms, light as guilt and twice as persistent. His driver had arrived with a replacement vehicle, a black SUV with windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets and passengers alike. Tyler fell asleep before they reached the first stoplight, his head dropping against Braden's shoulder with the sudden collapse of a child who'd been running on fear and adrenaline for 8 hours. The teddy bear remained clutched between them, its worn fabric a bridge between past and present that Braden couldn't yet bring himself to examine too closely. His penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a building overlooking the lake, all steel and glass and carefully curated art that had been selected by a decorator he'd never met. The space had always felt appropriate rather than comfortable, a stage set for the life he was supposed to be living rather than one he actually inhabited. The guest bedroom became Tyler's by midnight, transformed by staff who asked no questions and worked with the efficiency of people who understood that hesitation could be fatal. Blue walls replaced gray ones, bookshelves appeared loaded with children's encyclopedias, and a bed with airplane-printed sheets occupied the space where a treadmill had gathered dust. Braden sat in a leather chair beside the bed, watching Tyler sleep with an intensity usually reserved for studying contracts or reading the faces of men across negotiating tables. The boy's breathing was steady, but shallow, and occasionally he'd whimper and curl tighter around the bear, fighting battles and dreams that were probably just memories. By dawn, his head of security had compiled a file 3 inches thick. Tyler's father was Malcolm Preston, 34, a former accountant who'd lost his job 2 years ago and never recovered the trajectory. His mother was Christine Hayes, dead in childbirth at 26. No family, no close friends who'd stayed in touch after the funeral. The medical records made Braden's jaw tighten in ways that his business partners would have recognized as dangerous. Tyler had been born with a clubfoot, a correctable condition that required surgery and physical therapy. Malcolm had started the treatment, then stopped when the money ran out, leaving his son with a brace and a limp that would worsen without intervention. But buried in the school district's preliminary assessment reports was something that made Braden read the same paragraph 3 times. Tyler, at age 3, could solve mathematical problems designed for children twice his age. He understood patterns and sequences intuitively, saw numerical relationships that most adults needed calculators to comprehend. The daycare he'd briefly attended before money became too tight had flagged him as potentially gifted, recommending specialized testing that Malcolm had never pursued. Instead, the boy's intelligence had remained trapped in a world of eviction notices and empty refrigerators, a diamond buried in dirt because no one had bothered to dig. Braden made calls as the sun rose over Lake Michigan, turning his windows into sheets of gold that did nothing to warm the cold efficiency of his orders. The best orthopedic surgeon in Chicago would clear his schedule. The best child psychologist would make herself available. The best lawyers would begin paperwork that would move faster than any court system was designed to allow. Tyler woke at 7, his eyes snapping open with the alertness of someone used to danger. His first movement a check to ensure the teddy bear remained in his grip. He looked around the unfamiliar room with the calculating gaze of a much older child, cataloging exits and potential threats before his eyes found Braden still sitting in the chair. "Where's my daddy?" The question came without tears. A simple request for information that somehow hurt worse than if he'd been sobbing. Braden had prepared several answers during the night, discarding each as either too honest or too kind, before settling on something in between. "I don't know yet, but you're safe here, and no one will hurt you." He kept his voice level, the same tone he'd used to report quarterly earnings or discuss territorial boundaries. Tyler studied him for a long moment, and Braden had the unsettling sensation of being evaluated by someone who understood far more than 3 years should have taught him. The boy sat up slowly, his leg brace clicking against the bed frame, and looked down at the airplane sheets with something like wonder. "Is this mine?" The question carried disbelief, as if the concept of ownership was foreign, as if everything in his short life had been temporary and conditional. "Yes, everything in this room is yours." Braden stood and walked to the window, giving Tyler space to process, his own reflection in the glass showing a man who looked exactly the same as yesterday, despite feeling fundamentally altered in ways he couldn't articulate. A knock at the door announced breakfast, wheeled in on a cart by his housekeeper who'd been briefed overnight, and showed no surprise at finding a small boy in the penthouse. Pancakes, eggs, bacon, orange juice in a plastic cup with cartoon characters printed on the sides, food that Braden had ordered despite never having purchased such items in his life. Tyler approached the cart like it might vanish if he moved too quickly, his small hand reaching for a strip of bacon before pausing to look at Braden for permission. The hesitation spoke of meals withheld as punishment, of food used as leverage, of a hunger that had become so constant it was almost comfortable in its familiarity. "Eat whatever you want. All of it." Braden watched as Tyler built a plate with shaking hands, the portions small despite permission, the behavior of someone who'd learned that taking too much led to consequences. The boy ate slowly, methodically, his eyes never leaving the food as if expecting it to be taken away mid-bite. Later that morning, Dr. Sarah Chen arrived with x-rays and diagrams, her reputation for reconstructive surgery in children preceding her like a shield. She examined Tyler's leg with gentle efficiency, explaining each step before she touched him, earning trust through consistency rather than false cheerfulness that children always saw through. 3 surgeries over 18 months, then physical therapy for a year after that. He'll walk without the brace, possibly run if we're fortunate. She delivered the prognosis to Braden in the hallway, while Tyler played with building blocks that had appeared from somewhere in the apartment's depths. "But Mr. Braden, I need to ask, what's your relationship to this child?" The intake forms are somewhat unclear. Braden's answer came after a pause that stretched long enough for Dr. Chen to shift her weight nervously. "I'm going to adopt him. The paperwork starts Monday." He said it with the same certainty he'd used to announce a merger or acquisition, as if his will alone could reshape legal systems and bureaucratic timelines. The first surgery happened on a Thursday in mid-November, in a private surgical center where Braden's money bought privacy and the city's best anesthesiologist. Tyler went under clutching the teddy bear, his last conscious words a whispered question about whether it would hurt, and Braden found himself making promises about pain management with an intensity usually reserved for business guarantees. He waited in the surgical wing's family room, a space designed for comfort with its soft lighting and magazine selection and coffee that tasted like cardboard. His phone buzzed with messages about territory disputes and shipping schedules, but for the first time in 15 years, he let them go unanswered while he stared at abstract art that probably cost more than most people's houses. When Dr. Chen emerged 4 hours later, her surgical cap still on, and exhaustion written in the set of her shoulders, she smiled before speaking, a good sign that Braden's chest responded to before his brain could process. Textbook perfect. He'll need 6 weeks in a cast. Then we reassess for the next procedure. Tyler spent 3 days in the hospital's private wing, a suite that felt more like a hotel room than a medical facility, with windows overlooking the city and furniture that didn't scream institutional efficiency. Braden slept in the chair beside the bed, his Italian suits replaced with jeans and sweaters that his housekeeper had purchased because his own wardrobe contained nothing remotely casual. The pain medication made Tyler chatty in ways he hadn't been when awake and guarded, his 3-year-old vocabulary mixing with concepts that seemed pulled from somewhere beyond his age. He talked about numbers like they were friends, about patterns he saw in the ceiling tiles, about how 0 was the most important number because it meant starting over. "Why 0?" Braden asked on the second night, adjusting Tyler's pillow for the 4th time, while nurses checked vitals and pretended not to notice who was providing bedside care. The question came from genuine curiosity, rather than polite interest, this small boy's perspective somehow more compelling than the economic theories he studied for business. Tyler's eyes were heavy with medication, but focused with the intensity that Braden was learning meant his mind had locked onto something important. Because 0 means nothing bad happened yet. It's like before mistakes. Before people leave, it's the number where everything's still okay. The explanation came in pieces, separated by yawns, but the philosophy behind it hit Braden like a punch from someone who'd learned to find power in unexpected places. They returned to the penthouse on Sunday evening, Tyler navigating his new cast with the determination of someone used to physical limitations. The teddy bear now wearing a small cast of its own that a pediatric nurse had created from gauze and tape. The apartment felt different with a child in it, as if Tyler's presence had rearranged molecules and made space breathe differently. That first night home, Braden carried Tyler to bed and turned to leave, assuming his duties ended at the doorway. But a small hand caught his sleeve, the grip weak but insistent, and Tyler's voice came small and frightened in the darkness that expensive curtains made absolute. "Can you stay? Just until I sleep?" The request carried shame, as if asking for comfort was weakness, as if he expected rejection or annoyance. Braden had dismissed grown men with empires at stake, had ended conversations that determined the fate of neighborhoods, but he couldn't walk away from those words. He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight making the mattress dip, and found himself asking a question that surprised him with its gentleness. "What do you want to talk about?" He expected cartoons or toys, or the simple topics that filled children's minds, not prepared for Tyler to launch into an explanation of prime numbers. They're special because they can't be broken into smaller pieces. They only divide by themselves. And 1. Tyler's small fingers traced patterns on the blanket, counting invisible sequences, his cast propped on a pillow that Braden had positioned with more care than he'd known he possessed. Like 7 or 11, they're whole all by themselves. The explanation continued, mixing mathematical concepts with the kind of metaphorical thinking that shouldn't exist in a 3-year-old brain. Braden listened, occasionally asking questions that Tyler answered with such earnest enthusiasm that something in his chest ached with unfamiliar warmth, as if emotions he'd locked away were escaping through cracks this child had somehow created. "Why do you like numbers so much?" Braden asked when Tyler paused to yawn, his small body fighting sleep with the stubbornness of someone who'd learned that unconsciousness could mean abandonment. The room smelled of the lavender spray his housekeeper had added to the sheets, mixing with the antiseptic scent that still clung to Tyler's cast. Tyler's answer came slow, thoughtful, his eyes already half closed but his mind still processing. Numbers don't lie. 2 + 2 is always 4. It doesn't change because someone's mad or drunk or decides to leave. It's always true, every time, no matter what. The words carried weight beyond their mathematical accuracy, revealing a worldview built on finding constants in chaos. Braden felt something crack further in his chest, this child's need for reliability and truth speaking to the parts of himself he'd buried under years of calculated violence and strategic relationships. He reached out without thinking, and smoothed the blonde hair back from Tyler's forehead, the gesture feeling both foreign and necessary, his hand remembering gentleness he'd thought he'd trained out of himself. "What if I taught you more? About numbers. The offer emerged without planning, born from some instinct that this child's intelligence deserved nurturing rather than neglect. Tyler's eyes opened slightly, hope and suspicion warring in the blue depths that had already seen too much disappointment to accept promises at face value. Every night? The question came with such careful neutrality that Braden understood Tyler was protecting himself against inevitable disappointment, already preparing for the moment when this new stability would shatter like all the others. The boy's hand still clutched the teddy bear, knuckles white with the grip of someone holding their only anchor in a storm. The routine established itself over weeks that turned to months, Braden's evenings restructuring around Tyler's bedtime, and the mathematical discussions that had become their shared language. Winter deepened outside the penthouse windows, Lake Michigan freezing in sheets that groaned and cracked like artillery fire, while inside they built empires of numbers and equations. Dr. Chen performed the second surgery in January, and the third in March, each one successful beyond textbook expectations. Tyler's leg straightening degree by careful degree. The orthopedic brace came off in early April, replaced by physical therapy 3 times per week at a clinic that Braden had essentially purchased through strategic donations. The therapist was named Harper Quinn, 28, and fresh from a pediatric sports medicine fellowship, her competence immediately apparent in the way she assessed Tyler's gait and designed exercises that felt like games. She lasted 3 weeks before her engagement to another doctor pulled her to Boston, leaving the clinic scrambling to find a replacement who could handle their most important patient. The new therapist arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April, when magnolia trees were finally blooming along Michigan Avenue, and the air smelled of melting snow and distant lake water. Braden had stayed for the appointment, his presence in the therapy gym making staff nervous, despite the months they'd had to adjust to his involvement in Tyler's care. She walked in carrying a worn leather briefcase and wearing a gray wool coat despite the warming temperatures. Her dark hair pulled back in a style that suggested efficiency rather than fashion. Her name was Isla Montgomery, and the file his security team had compiled said she was 36, widowed at 32, possessed a PhD in applied mathematics alongside her physical therapy credentials. What the file didn't capture was the way she moved through the space with quiet confidence, her eyes taking in Tyler's cast removal scars and compensatory muscle development before she'd spoken a single word. She crouched to his level without the exaggerated cheerfulness that made children distrust adults, her voice pitched low and matter-of-fact. "I'm Isla. I'm going to help your legs get stronger so you can run if you want to." She extended her hand for Tyler to shake, treating him with the seriousness that Braden had learned this particular child required. "Harper left me notes saying you're very good at following instructions. That's going to make this easier for both of us." Tyler studied her with the evaluation skills he'd developed in a world where adults were variables rather than constants, his small hand finally reaching out to complete the handshake. "Can you tell me what we're going to do before we do it? I don't like surprises." The request came with the weight of someone who'd learned that unexpected changes usually meant pain or loss. Always. "And if something hurts, you tell me immediately and we stop. Your comfort matters more than my timeline." Isla's response carried the kind of straightforward honesty that children's instincts recognized as genuine, and Braden watched Tyler's shoulders relax fractionally, guard dropping in increments so small they'd be invisible to anyone not watching closely. The session progressed with careful precision, Isla explaining each stretch and exercise while Tyler listened with the focus he usually reserved for mathematical proofs. She asked about his favorite subjects, and when he said numbers, her face lit with recognition that went beyond polite interest, as if she'd found something unexpected and valuable in a place she hadn't thought to look. What kind of numbers? Primes? Fibonacci sequences? Fractals? The questions came naturally. No condescension in her tone, just genuine curiosity about a 3-year-old's mathematical interests. Braden found himself watching her instead of Tyler, noting the way her hands moved with controlled grace, and her voice never rose or fell into the exaggerated registers people used with children they didn't respect. Tyler launched into an explanation of prime numbers that segued into why circles were perfect, and how infinity wasn't scary if you understood it was just a concept rather than a destination. Isla listened while guiding him through leg lifts, her attention never wavering even when the clinic director appeared in the doorway and retreated quickly upon seeing who was present. When the session ended, Tyler's face was flushed with effort, but glowing with something Braden recognized as intellectual satisfaction, the pleasure of being heard and understood by someone fluent in his particular language. Isla wiped down the exercise mat and made notes in her tablet, her movements economical and assured. He's brilliant. You know that, right? She directed the comment to Braden without looking up, her tone suggesting statement rather than question. The way he conceptualizes spatial relationships and patterns, that's not typical development. That's genuine gifted intelligence hiding behind age-appropriate vocabulary. Braden moved closer, his expensive shoes silent on the rubber gym flooring, drawn by something in her voice that suggested she saw Tyler as a person, rather than a patient or opportunity. His previous situation didn't encourage academic development. I'm working to change that. The admission came easier than expected, this woman's directness somehow bypassing his usual careful word selection. Good. Kids like Tyler need advocates who understand that intelligence without emotional support creates problems rather than solving them. Isla closed her tablet and finally met his eyes, her gaze steady and measuring, apparently unbothered by his reputation or the way people typically flinched from direct contact. He also needs consistency. I assume you're not planning to disappear? The question carried challenge wrapped in professional concern, and Braden felt something shift in his chest, not offense at being questioned, but respect for someone who'd prioritize a child's welfare over fear of consequence. I'm adopting him. The court date is set for June. He delivered the information with the finality of someone unused to having his decisions questioned, but softened by context that suggested explanation rather than dismissal. Isla's expression flickered with surprise before resetting to professional neutrality, but not before Braden caught something that looked like approval in the slight upturn of her mouth. Then he's fortunate. Most kids in his situation fall through cracks that the system pretends don't exist. She gathered her coat and briefcase, movement suggesting their interaction was ending despite something in the air between them that felt unfinished. Same time Thursday? Tyler's voice interrupted, small and hopeful, his hand finding Braden's automatically in the way he'd started doing when uncertain or seeking reassurance. The gesture still surprised Braden every time, this casual assumption of protection and permanence from someone who'd learned early that neither was guaranteed. Thursday's session became Fridays, which multiplied into 3 appointments weekly as Tyler's progress accelerated beyond standard recovery timelines. Isla brought different exercises each time, challenging his growing strength while explaining the biomechanics in terms that satisfied his need to understand the why beneath every instruction. By mid-May, Tyler was walking without a limp, his gait smoothing into something that resembled typical childhood movement rather than compensated injury. Braden watched from the observation area, ostensibly reviewing contracts on his tablet, but actually tracking every interaction between therapist and patient with attention he couldn't quite justify as mere parental concern. Isla started arriving 15 minutes early, using the extra time to discuss Tyler's mathematical interests, with a depth that went beyond polite conversation. She'd bring puzzles and logic problems disguised as warm-up exercises, her face lighting with genuine pleasure when Tyler solved them faster than she'd anticipated, sometimes using methods she hadn't considered. The clinic director mentioned casually that Isla usually maintained strict professional boundaries, never socializing with patients' families outside scheduled appointments. Yet here she was, accepting Braden's invitation to coffee after a particularly challenging session where Tyler had finally mastered single-leg balance exercises that had frustrated him for weeks. They sat in a cafe 3 blocks from the clinic, Tyler coloring geometric patterns at the table while consuming hot chocolate with whipped cream that left a mustache across his upper lip. Isla ordered black coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup, despite the May warmth, a gesture that Braden recognized as comfort-seeking, rather than cold-fighting. You studied mathematics before physical therapy? He asked the question he'd been holding since reading her file, curiosity overriding his usual practice of pretending ignorance about information he'd acquired through investigation. Her Ph.D. dissertation had been on fractal geometry applications in architectural design, published by MIT Press and cited in journals he'd needed a translator to understand. Isla's hands tightened fractionally on the cup, her eyes tracking Tyler's crayon movements before returning to meet Braden's gaze directly. I taught university mathematics for 6 years. My husband was an architect. We were collaborating on a research project about structural optimization using natural patterns. The past tense carried weight that didn't need elaboration, grief compressed into grammatical choices. He died 4 years ago. Aneurysm. No warning, no goodbye, just a Tuesday morning that started normal and ended with hospital fluorescence and doctors using words like unsurvivable. She delivered the information with the flatness of someone who'd told the story enough times that emotion had worn smooth, but her knuckles whitened against the ceramic in ways that suggested the polish was surface rather than depth. Braden understood that particular kind of loss, the violence of normalcy interrupted, though his own ghosts wore different faces and carried different crimes. "And you changed careers because mathematics reminded you of him?" The question came gentler than his usual interrogation style, this woman's honesty somehow earning reciprocal vulnerability he rarely offered. "Because sitting in a university office solving theoretical problems felt like living in a mausoleum. Physical therapy is concrete. People arrive broken and leave functional. The progress is measurable, the impact immediate." Isla's voice steadied as she spoke, finding solid ground in explanation. "Plus, the math is still there. Biomechanics is applied geometry. Gate analysis is pattern recognition. I didn't abandon it. I just found a version that bleeds less." Tyler looked up from his coloring, his blue eyes moving between the two adults with the assessment skills that constantly surprised Braden with their accuracy. "Isla's sad like you used to be, Papa, before you smiled more." The observation came with childish bluntness, no filter between perception and speech, and both adults froze as if caught in something neither had acknowledged. The Italian word slipped out before Braden could stop it. This child who'd started calling him that in private moments now using it publicly, as if testing whether the identity would hold under scrutiny. Isla's eyebrow raised fractionally, but she didn't comment, instead redirecting attention to Tyler's drawing of interlocking hexagons that demonstrated understanding of tessellation that shouldn't exist in a 3-year-old mind. Their coffee stretched into dinner at a family restaurant that Braden had never entered in 15 years of living blocks away, the kind of place with plastic menus and crayons offered automatically with children present. Tyler ate chicken fingers and explained why bees built hexagonal hives, while Isla listened with the focus usually reserved for academic lectures, occasionally adding insights about optimization and structural efficiency. Braden found himself laughing at something Tyler said about 0 being shaped like an egg, because both represented potential, the sound emerging rusty and unfamiliar from his throat. Isla smiled then, not the professional expression she wore at the clinic, but something genuine that reached her eyes and made them warm, despite the sadness Tyler had correctly identified living beneath. They walked back to where Braden's driver waited, Tyler between them holding both their hands, and chattering about a documentary he'd watched about fractals in nature. The spring evening smelled of blooming lilacs and distant rain, the city sounds muted by the comfortable silence that had settled over the adults like a shared blanket. At the car, Isla crouched to Tyler's level and tapped his nose gently. "You did excellent work today. By summer, you'll be running if you want to." The promise came with certainty, and Tyler beamed with pride before turning to Braden with expectation written across his small features, some question forming that the adults couldn't yet hear. "Can Isla come to dinner at our house? She likes numbers like me, and she should see my books." The request carried innocence wrapped around manipulation, this child somehow intuiting that bringing her into their space would shift something that both adults were circling without naming. Braden looked at Isla over Tyler's head, their eyes meeting with the weight of recognition. Two people who'd learned to survive by building walls, now finding them inconvenient in the presence of a child who didn't understand why adults made simple things complicated. Her expression held question and caution, and something that might have been hope if given permission to exist. Friday night? The invitation emerged before his tactical mind could intervene, stepping past the careful distance he maintained between his various lives, the public face, the business reality, the private space where Tyler was teaching him to be something beyond what reputation demanded. "I make decent pasta, and Tyler can show you his collection of math puzzles." Isla's smile widened incrementally, the gesture transforming her face from professionally pleasant to genuinely beautiful in ways that made Braden's chest tighten unexpectedly. "I'd like that, though I should warn you, I'm competitive about puzzles." Tyler might have found himself a worthy opponent. The playfulness in her voice felt like spring sun after winter, warm and surprising, and somehow necessary. Tyler pumped his fist in victory, a gesture he'd learned from a cartoon, his face glowing with the satisfaction of successful social engineering. "You can meet Bear, too. He's very old and only has one eye, but he's important." The introduction of the teddy bear into the invitation carried weight that the adults understood even if Tyler didn't fully comprehend. This was admittance into the inner circle, presentation of the sacred object that had survived abandonment and surgery, and the slow rebuilding of a life worth living. Friday arrived with Braden doing something he'd never done before, leaving the office at 4 p.m. to prepare dinner rather than delegating the task to his housekeeper. He chopped vegetables with the precision he applied to dismantling business competitors, following a recipe his grandmother had taught him before she died, and he'd forgotten that cooking could be meditation rather than necessity. Tyler helped by setting the table, his movements careful with the responsibility, placing 3 plates in a triangle configuration that he insisted was mathematically balanced. He'd changed clothes twice before settling on jeans and a shirt with a dinosaur printed on the front, asking Braden 3 times if he looked okay for company, with the anxiety of someone who'd rarely had guests and wasn't sure of protocol. Isla arrived at 6, carrying a bottle of wine in a paper bag that clinked with promise, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back, wearing jeans and a cream sweater that made her look younger than her files suggested. She handed the wine to Braden and the bag to Tyler, who opened it to find a kaleidoscope and a book about mathematical proofs for children, his squeal of delight echoing through the penthouse in ways that made the expensive minimalism feel less like a museum. Dinner conversation flowed easily, mathematics providing the river that carried them through potentially awkward territory into genuine connection. Isla challenged Tyler's assertions about prime numbers. He defended his positions with logic that made her laugh with pleasure, and Braden found himself contributing observations about pattern recognition in business that she immediately connected to game theory and probability. They moved to the living room after eating, Tyler demonstrating his puzzle collection, while the adults drank wine and pretended they weren't hyper-aware of proximity and casual touches that lasted seconds longer than necessary. The city lights spread below the windows like a field of stars, Chicago's grid pattern a mathematical proof of human organization imposed on natural chaos. Tyler fell asleep on the couch during his explanation of why some infinities were bigger than others, his head pillowed on Isla's lap with the trust of someone who'd decided she was safe. She stroked his hair absently while finishing her wine, her other hand somehow finding its way to rest near Braden's on the leather cushion, their fingers not quite touching but existing in the space where intention lived before action. "He told me you saved him. From the train station." Isla's voice came quiet, pitched not to wake the sleeping child, her eyes still on Tyler's peaceful face rather than meeting Braden's gaze. "He said you were the first person who stopped and saw him, instead of looking through him like he was invisible." Braden carried Tyler to bed, while Isla waited in the living room, the boy barely stirring as he was transferred from couch to airplane sheets, the teddy bear automatically gathering into his arms. When Braden returned, she was standing at the window, her reflection in the glass overlaying the city lights in ways that made her look like part of the skyline, rather than separate from it. "He's lucky to have you. Not many men would stop their entire life for a child they found by accident." She spoke to his reflection rather than turning, her voice carrying something that sounded like testing, as if his answer would determine whether this tentative connection had foundation or was built on sand. It wasn't entirely accident. Braden joined her at the window, their shoulders nearly touching, the proximity intentional now, rather than coincidental. "The teddy bear he carries, I gave that to someone 23 years ago, someone who disappeared without explanation or trace. Seeing it again in that station felt like a message I was supposed to pay attention to." Isla turned then, her expression cycling through surprise and understanding, and something sharper that might have been recognition of fate disguised as coincidence. "You think Tyler's connected to her? This woman from your past?" The question came without judgment, just curiosity about the mathematics of chance and meaning. "I had his DNA tested against mine. No biological relation, but I can't shake the feeling that he was meant to find me. Or, I was meant to find him." Braden had never spoken these thoughts aloud, the mysticism of it feeling foolish against his reputation for cold calculation. Maybe I'm assigning meaning to randomness, because the alternative is accepting that 3-year-olds get abandoned in train stations for no reason that makes the universe make sense. Or maybe some connections exist outside biology and logic. Maybe family is choice rather than blood, and fate is just the word we use for paying attention to moments that matter. Isla's hand found his on the window ledge, her fingers lacing through his with the naturalness of people who'd been touching for years rather than hours. His mother died giving birth to him, right? Maybe she sent him to you. Maybe the bear was the breadcrumb trail. The theory should have sounded absurd, but standing in his living room with this woman who understood both mathematics and mystery, it felt possible that Christine Hayes had somehow known, that the universe occasionally conspired toward rightness, that his finding Tyler in Union Station was the answer to a question he'd stopped asking years ago when hope felt more dangerous than cynicism. They stood in silence while the city hummed 40 floors below, 2 people who'd learned to survive by building walls now considering what it might mean to dismantle them. Isla's perfume carried jasmine notes that mixed with the lingering smell of pasta sauce, creating an olfactory memory that Braden's brain filed under important without consulting his rational mind. I should go. It's late. The words came without conviction, her hand still holding his, her body angled toward him, rather than the door in ways that suggested departure was obligation rather than desire. The space between them felt charged with possibility, the air holding its breath waiting for someone to move first. Braden turned to face her fully, his free hand rising to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, in a gesture that surprised him with its tenderness. Or you could stay. There are guest rooms. No expectations, just, I'd like you to be here when Tyler wakes up. He'll want to show you more puzzles, and I make decent coffee. The invitation stumbled over itself, his usual eloquence deserting him in the presence of something that felt significant enough to deserve better words. Isla's smile started slow and built to something that transformed her face completely, grief and caution giving way to tentative joy. I'd like that too. Fair warning, though. I'm particular about coffee preparation. You'll be judged. The playfulness returned, her other hand rising to rest against his chest, where his heart was beating faster than business meetings or territorial negotiations had ever managed. The kiss happened in the space between breaths. Neither could say later who moved first, just that suddenly their mouths were learning each other's shape and taste, wine and hope, and the metallic edge of fear that came with risking comfort for something potentially better. It lasted long enough to feel like decision rather than impulse, gentle enough to leave room for retreat, but certain enough to mark a threshold crossed. When they separated, Isla's eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her laugh sounded shaky but genuine. That was either terrible timing or perfect timing, and I genuinely can't tell which. Her fingers traced the line of his jaw, mapping territory that few people touched voluntarily, his reputation usually maintaining distance that felt safer than proximity. Let's call it brave timing and see what happens. Braden caught her hand and kissed the palm, a gesture from some half-remembered romance that felt appropriate for a moment that deserved more than his usual efficient approach to human connection. Besides, Tyler's probably going to take credit for this. His matchmaking skills are becoming concerning for someone who still believes in Santa Claus. They migrated to the couch, sitting close enough that her head found his shoulder naturally, his arm settling around her with the ease of muscle memory from a life he'd never actually lived. The city lights provided ambient glow sufficient for comfort without glare, and the silence between them held conversation without words. Two people who'd spent years guarding against exactly this kind of vulnerability, now finding it less terrifying than anticipated. Tell me about your husband, if you want to. Braden made the offer quietly, understanding that grief needed acknowledgement rather than avoidance, that her past deserved space in whatever this was becoming. Isla stiffened briefly before relaxing again, her breathing evening out as she gathered thoughts into speech. His name was Thomas. He laughed at terrible jokes and left coffee cups everywhere and thought fractals were proof of divine mathematics. Her voice carried affection worn smooth by time, love that had transformed from sharp loss into tender memory. He would have liked Tyler, would have spent hours teaching him about the golden ratio and Fibonacci spirals. Would have probably liked you too, once he got past being intimidated by the whole, she waved her hand vaguely, terrifying crime boss reputation. Braden surprised himself by laughing, the sound rusty, but real. I'm not actually a crime boss. That's exaggeration and selective fact interpretation. I just happen to run businesses that occasionally require, he paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing, firm boundary enforcement. Right. And I occasionally require firm boundary enforcement when patients don't do their exercises. We're basically the same. Isla's dry tone made him laugh again. This woman's ability to puncture his carefully maintained mystique, somehow endearing rather than threatening. She understood the difference between reputation and reality, between the armor people wore and the vulnerable flesh beneath. The conversation drifted through topics like a river finding its course, her dissertation research, his grandmother's influence on his early life, Tyler's uncanny ability to sense emotional weather and adjust his behavior accordingly. They talked until the city's lights began to dim with approaching dawn, until exhaustion made their words slur slightly, until sleeping seemed like the next logical step in a night that had already crossed several lines they couldn't uncross. Braden showed her to the guest room at 4 a.m., their goodnight lingering in the doorway with the awkwardness of teenagers navigating first relationships, rather than adults in their 30s with accumulated histories. Her fingers traced his jaw one more time, memorizing texture and bone structure. before she pulled back with visible effort and closed the door between them. He stood in the hallway for several heartbeats, his chest tight with feelings he'd spent years teaching himself not to experience, before heading to his own room. But he detoured to check on Tyler first, finding him sprawled across the bed with one leg hanging off the edge and the teddy bear clutched upside down, peaceful in the way children are when their world feels secure. Morning arrived with Tyler bouncing on Braden's bed at 7 a.m., his voice pitched high with excitement that no reasonable hour could contain. "Is Isla still here? Did she stay for breakfast? Can we show her the roof garden?" The questions tumbled over each other, hope and anticipation making him vibrate with energy that surgery and therapy had finally unleashed. She emerged from the guest room looking rumpled and beautiful, her hair tangled and yesterday's clothes wrinkled, and Tyler launched himself at her with the confidence of someone who'd decided she belonged here. She caught him easily, laughing as he explained his entire morning routine and insisted she needed to see his newest puzzle immediately. No delays permitted. Breakfast became a production, Braden making pancakes while Isla helped Tyler set the table with mathematical precision, their collaboration natural as if they'd been doing this for years rather than hours. The morning light through the penthouse windows turned everything gold, and the smell of coffee mixed with maple syrup created an atmosphere of domesticity that felt foreign and necessary simultaneously. They spent the morning on the roof garden, Tyler running between planters with the abandon of someone whose body finally matched his spirit's intentions. No limp, no hesitation, just pure childhood joy that made the adults' eyes meet with shared understanding of miracle witnessed. The city spread around them, Chicago's architecture creating a canyon of steel and glass that somehow felt protective rather than claustrophobic. Isla stayed through lunch, then dinner, her departure time sliding forward with each excuse Tyler generated, and she didn't quite resist. They ordered Thai food and played board games that Tyler modified with new mathematical rules, creating chaos that somehow worked better than the original designs, his genius manifesting in ways that made both adults laugh until their sides ached. The weekend became a pattern that repeated through June. Isla arriving Friday evening and leaving Sunday night, the guest room slowly acquiring her belongings in unconscious increments. Braden's housekeeper started setting 3 places automatically, and Tyler's bedtime routine expanded to include goodnight kisses from both adults, his small arms encompassing them in hugs that felt like benediction. The adoption hearing was scheduled for June 15th, a Tuesday morning that arrived with clear skies and temperatures that promised summer's full arrival. Braden dressed in his most conservative suit, trying to look like someone judges would trust with a child, despite the reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. Tyler wore new clothes, pressed khakis, and a button-down shirt that he'd picked because it had subtle geometric patterns in the fabric that satisfied his aesthetic requirements. He carried the teddy bear despite Braden's gentle suggestion that maybe it could wait in the car, his small jaw set with determination that the bear had earned the right to witness this transformation from temporary to permanent. Isla met them at the courthouse, wearing a navy dress and heels that brought her nearly to Braden's height. Her presence there, despite no official role in the proceedings, speaking to how thoroughly she'd woven herself into their lives. Tyler held both their hands as they climbed the courthouse steps, creating a chain that looked from any angle like family, the kind built on choice rather than obligation. The courtroom smelled of old wood and legal precedent, its high ceilings and formal architecture designed to remind everyone that serious business happened here, that decisions made within these walls carried the weight of state sanction. The judge was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a reputation for prioritizing children's welfare over procedural convenience, which Braden's lawyers had assured him was ideal for their situation. Malcolm Preston sat in the back row, his presence unexpected and shocking, his face gaunt and weathered in ways that 8 months hadn't fully explained. He'd signed the relinquishment papers months ago, his rights formally terminated, but apparently he'd come to witness the final severing, to see what his son had become in more capable hands. Tyler saw him and froze, his small body going rigid with recognition and fear and confusion that no 3-year-old should have to navigate. But instead of running to his biological father, or breaking down in tears, he pressed closer to Braden's leg and whispered, "He looks sad, but I'm not going back, right? You promised. You're not going anywhere. I promised, and I keep my promises." Braden spoke clearly enough for Malcolm to hear, the words carrying finality that made the biological father's shoulders slump further, but also something that might have been relief, that his failure had at least resulted in his son's salvation, that abandonment had somehow transformed into the best decision he'd ever made. The hearing lasted 20 minutes. the judge reviewing home studies and psychological evaluations and medical records that painted a picture of transformation. She asked Tyler if he was happy, and he responded with an explanation of why prime numbers were like family, whole and unbreakable by outside forces, that made everyone in the courtroom smile, despite not fully understanding the mathematical metaphor. When the judge's gavel fell with 3 decisive strikes, declaring Tyler officially and permanently Braden's son under Illinois law, the sound echoed like thunder and benediction simultaneously. The teddy bear witnessed it all from Tyler's lap, its one good eye reflecting courtroom lights, having survived another transformation from temporary hope to permanent truth. They walked out into June sunshine that felt appropriate for new beginnings, magnolia trees in full bloom lining the courthouse square with pink petals that the breeze scattered like confetti. Isla walked slightly behind them, giving father and son their moment, but Tyler turned and grabbed her hand, pulling her forward into the configuration he'd decided was correct. 2 adults flanking 1 small boy, creating protection and belonging in equal measure. Malcolm approached as they reached the steps, his hands shaking and his eyes red-rimmed with tears he'd been holding since entering the courthouse. He stopped 10 feet away, maintaining distance that acknowledged he'd forfeited the right to proximity, his voice breaking as he spoke to Braden rather than his former son. "Thank you. For doing what I couldn't. For seeing him when I'd stopped looking." The words came raw and honest, stripped of pride or excuses, just simple acknowledgement of failure and gratitude for rescue. "He deserves everything you can give him. He always did. I just couldn't be the person who delivered it." Braden felt Isla's hand on his back, steadying and supportive, felt Tyler's grip tighten on his other hand, seeking reassurance that this encounter wouldn't reverse the morning's declarations. He met Malcolm's eyes and saw a broken man who'd loved his son enough to let him go, who'd made the hardest choice available when all options were terrible. He'll know where he came from, but he'll also know where he belongs. The statement carried acknowledgement without forgiveness, recognition without reconciliation. Some mistakes were too large for apology to bridge. Some absences created permanent distance, but understanding could exist in the space where relationship couldn't. Malcolm nodded, his eyes finally dropping to Tyler, drinking in the sight of his biological son transformed, healthy, confident, standing between 2 adults who radiated protective devotion. "Goodbye, Tyler. Be brilliant. Be happy. Be everything I couldn't help you become." He turned then and walked away, his shoulders bent under weight that would probably never lift, disappearing into Chicago's foot traffic like he'd disappeared from that train station 8 months ago, this time permanently. Tyler watched him go without crying, his face thoughtful rather than sad, processing emotions that were probably too complex for full understanding, but recognizing endings when they arrived. "Can we go home now, Papa? I want to show Bear his new legal papers. He'll want to know we're official." The car ride home was quiet, Tyler between them in the back seat, his head on Isla's shoulder and his feet in Braden's lap, the teddy bear pressed between them all like a talisman that had survived impossible journey from past to present. The city rolled past the windows, Chicago's spring beauty on full display, the world continuing its rotation while their small constellation had just shifted into permanent alignment. That evening, Tyler fell asleep between them on the couch during a documentary about fractals in nature, his breathing even and peaceful, his face relaxed in ways that photographs from 8 months ago would show as impossible transformation. Braden and Isla sat in comfortable silence, their free hands intertwined over his sleeping form, protection and partnership and promise exchanged without words. "We're a family now. For real." Tyler's sleepy voice surprised them both, his eyes still closed, but his consciousness apparently not as absent as assumed. "Like prime numbers, whole by ourselves, but better together, unbreakable." The mathematical metaphor that had become his language for love and belonging, his way of making sense of security that had felt impossible until an overcoat-wearing stranger had knelt on a frozen train station floor and decided that walking away wasn't an option. Braden looked at Isla over their son's head, because Tyler was legally his son now, permanently and irrevocably, and saw his own emotions reflected in her eyes, love that had snuck up on them disguised as therapy appointments and dinner conversations, family that had assembled itself from broken pieces and decided that wholeness was achievable if everyone committed to the architecture. "Yes, Piccolo. For real." He pulled the blanket higher over Tyler's shoulders, the gesture automatic now after 8 months of nightly rituals and morning routines, after learning that fatherhood was verb rather than noun, action rather than biology. "Unbreakable. I promise." The city lights glowed through the windows, Chicago's evening settling into its familiar rhythm, while inside the penthouse, 3 people who'd been alone had become family. Sometimes love arrived violent and sudden like accidents, and sometimes it built slowly through physical therapy sessions and mathematical discussions and decisions to stay for breakfast that turned into decisions to stay forever. The teddy bear watched it all from its place of honor on the shelf, its one good eye reflecting lamplight, its worn fabric holding 23 years of secrets and witnesses to the truth that family isn't always blood, fate isn't always cruel, and the strongest foundations are sometimes built in train stations on the coldest nights by men who stop walking when everyone else would have passed by. Thank you for following this story about Tyler, Braden, and Isla, a family built not from blood, but from choice, courage, and the belief that love can arrive in the unlikeliest places. If this story touched your heart, please write in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from viewers around the world. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support helps us continue bringing these stories to life.